Get off this land or you'll bleed on it. 5 riders closed on Kaya, hunted, barefoot, running into the night that changed everything before either of them understood why. She ran toward a stranger's porch light through the Arizona dark, and neither of them expected what the next season would cost. The command hadn't been meant for her. That same threat had already been aimed at her brother 2 days before, on the bank of a spring that had watered her people's horses for longer than any fence in the territory had stood. And it had ended with him face down in the mud, while 5 men rode away like they'd swatted a fly off a horse's flank. Kaya hadn't stopped running since. Her lungs had burned past the point of pain into something flatter, more mechanical, and her bare feet had long since stopped registering rock and thorn. Behind her, faint but closing, came the low, unhurried drum of hooves. Not a chase exactly, a herding. Men who already believed they knew how this would end and saw no reason to hurry toward it. Ren Holloway heard the change in the wind before he saw anything move. 8 years on this stretch of grassland had taught him to read the land the way another man read a newspaper, and something in the rhythm of the grass that night was wrong. Too fast, too low, cutting a line across country where nothing should have been cutting a line at that hour. He straightened from the fence post he'd been mending, one hand still wrapped in wire, and looked north because the wind that evening was coming hard off the foothills and carrying something on it besides dust. Then he saw her, a shape low and desperate against pale grass, closing distance at a dead run. 5 riders strung along the ridgeline behind her, moving at an unbothered walk, rifles resting easy across their saddle horns. That detail turned his stomach cold before anything else did. Men ran their horses hard when they meant to catch something. These men walked theirs because they already knew they would. He left the wire cutters where they fell. He crossed the open ground toward her at a pace calculated to close distance without reading as a threat, not running, because a lone man sprinting out of the twilight toward a fleeing woman would only look like one more danger stacked onto the pile, hand raised, palm out, empty, the whole way across. She saw him from 60 yards, and he watched a decision cross her face, watched her body lean one way and catch itself, some animal calculation running faster than thought. For half a second, he believed she'd veer from him too, treat him as one more threat in a world that had apparently narrowed down to nothing else. She didn't. She came straight at him because he stood between her and the men behind her, and that was the only arithmetic left to do. Up close, gasping, one hand pressed hard against her ribs as if holding something inside from coming loose, he saw what the distance had hidden. She wasn't more than 20, her doe-skin dress torn at the shoulder, dark hair come loose and stuck to a face gone gray with exhaustion, and something under the exhaustion that looked a great deal like grief. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what she'd done, or taken, or run from. There wasn't time for asking, even if he'd wanted it. "Come with me." 2 flat words, not a question. Whether she understood the English or only the tone beneath it, she came, because a stranger with an empty hand in front of you and 5 armed men behind only left room for one kind of arithmetic. The barn stood closer than the house. He'd built it that way years back for reasons that had nothing to do with this and everything to do with getting stock under cover fast in a storm. He'd never once imagined it would be a person he was getting under cover. He walked her through the door and pointed her toward the dark corner behind the stacked hay, where shadow pooled thick even at noon. "Stay here, don't move. Whatever you hear." She looked at him a beat too long. Not trust, He understood trust well enough to know this wasn't that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Not after whatever afternoon had put her running across his land. But something. A first small brick set into a foundation that might someday become trust. She folded herself down into the dark between the bales and was gone from sight like she had never stood there at all. He caught the mare's lead, walked her to the near stall, put his back to the door, and picked up a hoof pick as though his hands had been doing exactly this the whole time, as though his heart weren't slamming his ribs hard enough to hear. That was the trick of it. A man made it look like nothing had happened, kept his hands busy so his face didn't have to explain itself. The riders reached the yard 11 minutes later. He counted that too. 11 minutes of cleaning a hoof that needed no cleaning, 11 minutes of listening to his own pulse and willing it to slow, which had never once worked in his life and didn't work now. 5 horses, 5 sets of hooves on packed dirt. He didn't turn right away. Let them come to him. Let them see a rancher doing rancher things, unbothered, unafraid, because if solitude had burned one lesson into him over 8 years, it was this. The man who looks like he's hiding something has already lost the conversation before it starts. The 5th horse carried the man Ren had been dreading without letting himself think the word. Cyrus Wexler sat his black gelding just inside the gate, the way he sat everything, like a man who had never once had to wonder whether a room or a spring or a territory belonged to him. 50-some years old, thick through the shoulders in a way money hadn't softened, a face gone smooth from decades of never having to worry about anything at all. He owned more range than any 3 ranchers combined, and every year he owned a little more, and the men who sold it to him rarely looked glad about the selling, even when the money was good. Behind him the other 4 sat their horses in a loose, watchful line. 3 faces Ren didn't know, hired for their disposition more than their skill with cattle, dressed for ranch work but carrying themselves like something else entirely. And the 4th face Ren wished, for one more heartbeat, he had never had cause to recognize. Holloway, easy, like a man remarking on weather. Lost something out this way, a woman. My men have been tracking her since sunup. Ren kept the hoof pick moving, though there was nothing left on that hoof worth cleaning. What did she take? A flicker crossed behind Wexler's eyes, small, gone fast. That's not your concern. Ren set the hoof down, wiped his hands on his thighs, bought himself a second, and a second was worth having right then. I haven't seen any Apache on my land today. Not running, not walking, not anything. Wexler's gaze slid past him toward the barn and held there a beat too long. Mind if my boys take a look around? The cold hit Ren's stomach exactly the way he'd known it would since he first saw 5 men moving at a walk instead of a run. I mind. He didn't blink saying it. That was when Ren's eyes went to the 4th rider and stayed. He knew that face the way a man knows a face he buried, or believed he'd buried, somewhere he no longer visited. Silas Rourke, heavier now, a scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before, hat pulled low as if trying to disappear inside his own collar. But it was him, the same man who'd once dragged Ren 2 miles on his own back, out of a gully with a bullet in his shoulder and half his blood already soaked into the dust, because there'd been no spare horse, and Ren couldn't walk, and dying wasn't an option Rourke was willing to allow. Rourke's eyes met his for exactly 1 second and slid away. That was worse than anything Wexler had put into words, worse than the rifles, worse than the unhurried pace they'd ridden in on. A man who doesn't know you is one thing, A man who knows you and looks away. That's a man who's already chosen a side he doesn't like and can't do a thing about it. Wexler let the silence stretch until it meant something, then nodded once. The nod of a man deciding a delay costs him nothing because he intends to come back and next time not ask permission at all. We'll water the horses and be on our way. Ren pointed toward the trough and didn't move from where he stood until every last one of them had ridden back out through his gate. He watched the dust settle behind 5 sets of hooves heading north, unhurried the whole way. The way men ride when they have already decided today's setback costs them nothing. He waited another 11 minutes before walking to the barn. They're gone. 2 words into the dark. Nothing more. Nothing moved for a long moment. Then hay rustled, and she rose from the shadows slow, testing each sound before trusting it, and stepped into what was left of the afternoon light through the door. Up close, in daylight, without the running blurring her, he could finally see her properly, younger than he'd first guessed, but there was nothing fragile in how she held herself. Something in her spine, in the set of her shoulders, had been forged by more than one hard year. Thank you. Careful English, deliberate, each word placed exactly where she meant it to sit. I won't ask questions yet. Reckon you'll tell me when you're ready, and if you're never ready, I suppose we'll go on not knowing together. Something close to a smile touched the corner of her mouth, gone as fast as it came, but he'd seen it. Kaya. Ren. She studied him a moment longer than the introduction required. You knew one of them. Not a question. He should have expected that. A woman who could outrun 5 armed men on foot hadn't survived this long by missing things. Rourke. The name came out rougher than he meant it to. Long time ago, another life. He looked away from you. Yes, that means something. It means he's ashamed. A man doesn't look away from an old friend unless some part of him knows he shouldn't be standing where he's standing. He built the fire small and low that night, just light enough to see by, not enough to announce itself to the county. A habit born of 8 years living alone, small fires, quiet nights, nothing to draw attention to a man who'd worked hard to be forgotten. Kaya ate slow, careful, the way a body eats when it's been running on empty too long to trust being filled again too fast. He'd seen that once before, in another life, and pushed the memory back down before it could finish forming. She watched the fire, watched him sometimes when she thought he wasn't paying attention, though he always was. The stars came out hard and bright, the way they only did that far from any town with enough lamps to dim them. Somewhere past the west fence line came the low, lonesome call of a coyote, the way it always did. It was at the spring. The words came finally into the quiet, her eyes on the flames instead because that made them easier to say. He waited, didn't press. He'd learned that lesson a long time ago and never forgot it. The worst thing you could do to someone who'd been running was make them feel they owed you an explanation before they'd caught their breath enough to give one. My people have used that water longer than there's a word for this territory, a route we've walked every season for longer than anyone living can remember. Something low in his voice. I know the spring. Something in his voice must have caught her attention, because her eyes came up to him, held a moment, then went back to the fire when he gave nothing more. 2 of Wexler's men were there. I don't think they saw me. I was in the brush along the bank filling water skins, and I saw them before they saw anything. They were talking to my brother, Taji. The name fell into the silence like a stone into still water. He is Was, she corrected herself, with a kind of practiced grimness, the tone of someone who has had to say something difficult enough times that saying it no longer breaks her voice, only bends it. He was the eldest among us. He'd walked this land before any of these ranches had fences. He carried papers with him, documents. I heard the word in English. One of Wexler's men used it, papers, and Taji wouldn't hand them over. Ren felt the cold return to his stomach, the same cold that had settled when he first saw 5 riders on the ridge. What happened? It wasn't really a question. He already knew the shape of the answer. He'd known it since he'd seen her running, as if the ground itself meant to swallow her. Kaya's jaw tightened. For a moment she stayed silent, and the fire crackled and popped in the silence, and somewhere past the fence came the low, mournful call of an owl in the dark. They killed him. 3 flat words, the only way she found she could say it at all without the rest of them coming apart on the way out. On the bank, in broad daylight, like it was nothing. Ren closed his eyes for 1 second, long enough to feel the whole weight of it settle in him, because he knew that spring, knew that bank, knew it the way a man knows the place where he buried something he loved and never went back to visit. Because visiting meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling it all again, fresh as if no time had passed at all. His wife was buried less than a quarter mile from where Kaya's brother had died. He didn't say that. Couldn't, not yet, not with her wound still open and raw, and needing more room than his own old grief had any right to take up that night. I'm sorry. The only thing that came instead, simple, inadequate, the only 2 words that fit in the space where 100 better ones should have been and weren't. Kaya looked at him a long moment. Something in her face shifted, not softening exactly, more recalibrating, as if she were reweighing something about the stranger who'd hidden her in a barn, fed her, and never once demanded she explain herself. When they finished, she went on, they searched him, took what they found, rode back toward Wexler's land like men finishing a chore before supper. And you? What did they miss? Her hand went briefly to the collar of her dress, to where the embroidery had come loose on one side, then stopped, returned to her lap. There was a small pouch. Taji pressed it into the mud beneath a cottonwood root before it happened. Like some part of him already knew what was coming and wanted to make sure it wasn't lost with him. Ren thought about that, thought about what kind of man does that in his last moments, presses something precious into the earth not to save himself, because there was no saving himself by then, but to save something larger than himself, something that would outlive him. It was one of the bravest things he'd ever heard of, and he thought it in silence, without saying it aloud, because some things belonged to the man who did them, and not to the stranger hearing them secondhand around a low fire. I went back for it. I don't remember deciding to. My feet just carried me there, the way water finds low ground without anyone telling it to. She exhaled slowly, something in her chest loosening with the release. I found the pouch, opened it. There were maps inside, and a survey agreement, names I didn't fully understand, but I understood enough to know what mattered. Enough to know why Taji died protecting it instead of simply handing it over. And then you ran. And then I ran. She nodded, a small, silent confirmation. Because when Wexler's men came back an hour later, when they found Taji and found tracks in the mud that weren't theirs, I already knew. Stopping was never going to be an option, not for me. The fire had burned down between them, coals glowing a dull orange in the dark. For a long while, quiet held between them. The night pressed close and quiet, and something in Ren's chest ached in a way it hadn't ached in a long time, a way he recognized uncomfortably as an old grief being handed a companion. "Where is it now?" The question came finally. The pouch. Her hand rose again to her collar. This time it didn't stop. She touched the place where the stitching had come loose, and he understood. Sewn in. I did it myself. Needle and thread I kept hidden in the hem. It seemed the only way to keep it close enough to protect and hidden enough to survive. Ren nodded slowly. He rose from where he'd been sitting, joints protesting the way they always did lately, and looked toward the edge of the north ridge where 5 riders had come from and where 5 riders had gone. Carefully, he waited aloud. "We need to think on what happens next. Could you send me away?" The question came flat, no accusation in it, only a flat, tired honesty. "Send me off. Pretend this afternoon never happened. It would be the safest thing." He looked at her a long moment. Safest for who? Not really a question, and something in his tone left no doubt the matter was already decided. Maybe it had been decided since the first moment he saw her running and dropped his tools and started walking toward her. She studied him, and whatever she found in his face seemed to answer questions she'd been carrying since the barn. Why? Simply that. He didn't answer right away. The wind moved low through the grass, and the fire popped once more before sinking toward silence. Because 8 years ago I made myself small, convinced myself smallness was safety, that a man who reaches for nothing can't lose anything. He looked at his hands, weathered, marked at the knuckles by 8 years of fence wire and hard work. It didn't work the way I thought it would. What happened? Softly, the same gentleness he'd shown her not an hour before? He was quiet a long moment. "My wife," he said. "Long story, old wound. Not one I'm ready to open tonight." His eyes met hers across the dying fire. "But I'll tell you this much. I know what it costs a person to stand by and do nothing while something gets taken that can't be given back. I've lived inside that cost for 8 years. His jaw tightened. "I'm not adding another chapter to it. Not today. Not while I still have the choosing in my own hands." Something passed between them then. Not trust, not quite. Trust took more than one night, more than one fire, more than one act of kindness against 5 armed men, but something adjacent to it, something that might, with enough nights like this one, grow into it. "There's a second man." Her voice dropped suddenly, her eyes cutting toward the dark ridge to the north. Ren's hand went instinctively to where his rifle rested against the porch post. "Where?" She tipped her chin, barely a movement, toward a low rise beyond the fence line. "He's been there since the sun went down, sitting, too still to be anyone just passing through." Ren looked into the darkness and saw nothing. Proof enough that she'd caught what his eyes, trained on 8 years of open country, had missed entirely. "One of Wexler's?" She was quiet a moment, considering. "No." After a moment. "This one feels like a man afraid of being seen by Wexler's riders, not one of them." That was an entirely different kind of shadow. Ren took up the rifle, didn't hurry, walked toward the ridge at the same measured pace he'd used crossing the field toward her that afternoon. Fast enough to cover ground, slow enough not to provoke whatever waited for him. The figure on the rise had both hands raised before Ren even crested the last rise. Palms open, empty. The universal language of a man who badly did not want to be shot in the dark on a stranger's land. Young, no more than 20, Apache like Kaya. The resemblance not obvious until Ren got close enough to see the set of the jaw, the same steadiness in the eyes. Once they'd found enough broken English and patient gesture between them to reach understanding, a name emerged. Besha, cousin. He'd been trailing her since midday. Not to bring her to them, to find her before they did. Ren studied him a long moment, decided the same way he'd decided about Kaya in the field that afternoon, that the danger here wasn't the young man standing in front of him with his hands raised. Come down. There's fire, there's food, and there's a great deal we're all going to need to talk through before this night is finished. Around the fire again, the three of them pieced together what neither Ren nor Kaya had fully understood before. The papers in the pouch weren't simply old family claims. They were a formal survey agreement signed years back, recognizing the spring and the grazing routes around it as belonging, by binding a cord, to the people who had walked it for generations before any fence went up. An agreement Wexler knew about. An agreement that stood like an old stubborn rock directly in the path of the expansion he'd been building for 3 years. The one that would let him consolidate everything east of the ridge into the largest holding the territory had ever seen. Taji had known Wexler was hunting the deed. He'd gone to the spring that day specifically to secure it, to make certain it didn't fall into hands that would burn it and deny it ever existed. And Wexler had found him first. There is a witness, someone besides us three who knows what's written in those papers. Ren looked up sharply. Who? My grandmother. She was present when the original agreement was signed years ago. Where? North. 3 days' ride. Will she come? Not here. Plain, certain. But she doesn't need to. Her word alone, carried to the right person, holds weight among our people heavy enough to move mountains if it has to. Ren looked toward where the last glow of the fire still caught faintly through the open barn door, where Kaya sat with a stitched collar and a dead brother 2 days gone, and a scrap of paper that might bring justice or get them all killed trying to deliver it. I need to ride to Sulphur Creek, talk to the sheriff, find out whether he's the kind of man who'll actually listen to what we've got or just one more piece Wexler already owns. Before any of that, though, before the ride, before the sheriff, before whatever the following weeks would cost all three of them, there's something worth pausing to say plainly. If a story like Kaya and Ren's is the reason you keep coming back to this channel, consider becoming a channel member. Tap join right beside the channel name. It's a small thing that helps keep stories like this one coming. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay on his back staring at a ceiling he'd stared at 10,000 nights before, listening to the wind move through the rafters, and let his mind wander to places he usually kept locked well shut. 8 years back, this land had felt like a penance, somewhere far enough from everything that everything couldn't reach him. He'd built his life here brick by brick, post by post, deliberately small, deliberately quiet, deliberately alone, because alone was safe, because alone was the year that had taken his wife and left him standing in a life that no longer held any particular meaning. He hadn't planned on any of this, hadn't planned on a woman running across his land with the weight of her whole people's future stitched into her collar, hadn't planned on seeing Rourke's face again, aged and ashamed, writing for the exact kind of man who profited from the exact kind of loss that had broken Ren in two. And he certainly hadn't planned that the ground where Taji died sat less than a quarter mile from the ground where his own wife, Ellen, was buried, as if the land itself had been keeping some terrible ledger all these years. waiting for the day both debts came due at once. He thought of Rourke's eyes sliding off his in the yard that afternoon. Thought about what a man has to carry deep inside himself to look away from someone who once carried him 2 miles on his own back, rather than let him die in a ditch. Something in that look hadn't been simple loyalty to a wage. Something in it had been shame. And shame, Ren had learned across 8 long, quiet years, was sometimes the only crack a man needed to finally do the right thing. If somebody gave him enough reason and enough time to remember what right used to feel like. Dawn came gray and cool, the particular hush before full light that made the whole world seem to be holding its breath. Ren was up before the sun cleared the ridge, saddling the bay mare in the dim early light of the barn, while Kaya and Beshi gathered what little they'd need for the ride ahead. Checking the cinch, he glanced at her. "You're sure of this trail? I've ridden it since before you were born." There was the faintest edge of dry humor in it, the first he'd heard from her since the field, since the running, since everything the day before had cost her. "I'm certain." He allowed himself for just a moment something close to a smile. "Then let's ride." They rode out the east gate as the first true light broke over the hills, 3 riders moving quiet and quick toward a town that might hold justice or might hold nothing at all, carrying between them a dead man's last act of courage, a stitched secret, and 8 years of one rancher's careful, deliberate solitude finally, irreversibly coming apart at the seams. Behind them, the ridge where 5 riders had waited stood empty in the morning light. But Ren knew, the way a man knows weather before it arrives, that empty didn't mean gone. It only meant waiting. The trail Kaya led them along wasn't a trail by any name a surveyor would recognize. It was a seam in the land, a narrow gap between 2 shoulders of rock folded so tight a horse had to walk single file, hooves choosing carefully over loose shale. Ren understood within the first quarter mile why Wexler's men would never find this way. You couldn't find what you didn't know to look for. Beshi rode last, watching the rear, not from any order, but because it was simply what he did, the way some men are born checking locks twice. The rock closed over them in places, cutting the sky down to a thin seam of blue, the air turning cool and mineral in the shaded stretches, the particular smell of stone that had never in its life felt direct sun. Ren found himself watching Kaya's back as she rode ahead, the ease with which she read a landscape that gave him nothing at all, and understood somewhere in that watching that he'd spent 8 years believing himself a man who knew this country. He'd only ever known the small fenced part that fit inside his own habits. They came out of the rocks a little after midday. Sulphur Creek spread below them, small and gray and unremarkable, thin threads of smoke rising from a dozen chimneys. Something tightened in Ren's chest at the sight of it, because a town was where things got decided, where paper and law and men in offices took a story and turned it into something that either held or didn't. He'd been avoiding towns for 8 years, curious how fast that stopped mattering. Kaya and Besh waited at the edge of the settlement without argument, a single look passing between them and Ren that settled the matter before a word passed at all. Walking into the sheriff's office beside a woman fleeing 5 armed men wasn't the way to open this conversation, not before Ren knew what kind of man he was dealing with. Sheriff Amos Purnell's office sat at the far end of the main street, a squat building with a hitching post gone silver with age out front. Ren found him at his desk, boots up, coffee gone cold, in no particular hurry to be interrupted. Recognition arrived slow. "Holloway. Been a while." Generally means trouble when I come to town. Generally does. Purnell studied him a beat longer, then waved him toward a chair. Ren laid it out plain. The riders, Kaya, the spring, Taji, the papers stitched into a torn collar 3 miles behind him in a stand of cottonwoods with a young man standing guard. He watched the sheriff's face the whole time, watched for the tell that would decide whether the rest of this fight had law standing anywhere near it or none at all. Something in Purnell's face didn't move the way it should have. Too smooth, too careful. The reaction of a man rehearsing calm rather than feeling it. That's a serious claim to bring me without much to back it. This, once Ren finished. Apache word against a man like Wexler won't hold much weight in front of a judge, and you know it. There's a survey agreement, real paper, real names, a witness who watched it get signed. Bring me the paper then. Can't do a thing with a story. Something about how flatly it landed. Too fast, too pat. The tone of a man who already knew the answer he wanted to give before Ren finished asking. Sat wrong in Ren's gut. He'd spent 8 years learning to trust that particular wrongness. He left the office without producing the deed. Some old instinct telling him not to hand Purnell anything real until he understood exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. That instinct proved itself before he'd even reached the edge of town. Passing behind the mercantile, he caught sight of a horse he recognized. One of Wexler's, tied at the rear of the feed store, and beside it, low-voiced Purnell himself, speaking to a rider Ren knew by now as one of Wexler's hired men. He couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. The posture alone made it plain. 2 men who knew each other well, talking business that wasn't meant for the street. Ren backed away before either of them turned and rode out of Sulphur Creek with a cold certainty settling into his chest that the law in this town wasn't a shield. It was one more thing Wexler already owned. He found Kaya and Besh waiting in the cottonwoods exactly where he'd left them. The sheriff's bought. Flat without preamble, because there wasn't a gentle way to say it and no reason to waste time trying to find one. Kaya's face didn't change much. The face of someone who'd expected as much and was only sorry to have it confirmed. Then who do we take it to? Ren thought a long moment, turning it over. He thought a long moment. There's a circuit judge, comes through the territory every few months, and a governor's office besides. Slower than a sheriff, but harder for one man to buy outright. We send word, but we don't wait on it. If Purnell's already reporting back to Wexler, Wexler knows by tonight we came to town asking questions. That means he won't wait either. He was right. It took less than 2 days for the answer to arrive, and it arrived with fire. Ren woke to the smell of smoke thick in his throat and the barn already burning. Flames red and furious devouring the dry wood walls, climbing high enough to lick at the belly of the night sky. There were no shouts, only the sound of hooves galloping away into the dark toward the north, hurried but strangely quiet. Men who'd finished their work and didn't care to be caught admiring it. He burst out the door with his rifle in hand, his face already blackening with smoke, and stopped dead in the yard. The enemy was already gone. Only the acrid stink of char and a deathly quiet remained, the wind carrying the smell of ash and burnt timber away toward the hills. Kaya was beside him a heartbeat later. Beshi just behind her, all 3 of them staring at the barn Ren had built with his own hands 8 years ago. The same barn that had hidden Kaya from 5 riders not a week before, collapsing slowly in on itself in a shower of orange sparks against a black sky. They saved what stock they could. It wasn't everything. By the time the flames burned low enough to leave alone, the eastern sky had gone gray with the first hint of dawn, and Ren stood in the wreckage with soot on his hands and a fury in his chest he hadn't felt in 8 long years. Not since the fever that took Ellen. Not since he'd stood over her grave and understood there was nothing left in the world he could do anything about. This time there was something to do. This time doing nothing wasn't an option he was willing to live inside any longer. It was Besh who found the tracks at first light, circling the ruin of the barn, 5 sets of hooves, the same unhurried gait as before, and among them, set slightly apart from the rest, one horse that had lingered near the gate longer than the others before finally turning to follow. Ren crouched over the print a long moment. Rourke. Just that. Quiet. Kaya looked at him. You're certain? I know that geldings stride better than I know most men's voices. He was there. And he didn't light the fire himself. See here. He never came within 30 yards of the barn wall. Stayed at the gate the whole time. Something passed across Kaya's face. Careful. Considering. A man who won't come closer than the gate is a man still deciding which side he's truly on. They didn't have long to wonder how that decision would land. 2 nights later, past midnight, a shape came in low along the fence line, on foot, leading his horse rather than riding it, moving with the particular care of a man who knows exactly how easily he could be shot for the trespass he was committing. Ren met him at the gate with the rifle steady but not raised because something in the way the man moved made plain this wasn't an attack. It was Rourke, hat off, hands visible, older and heavier than the man Ren remembered, but unmistakably him. I owe you a debt older than the one Wexler's paying me to forget. Low and rough, the first words he'd spoken to Ren directly in years. I've been standing on the wrong side of it too long already. Ren studied him a long, silent moment, weighing 8 years of memory against one man's quiet arrival in the dark. Then you'd best come in and tell us everything you know about what Wexler intends to do next. What Rourke knew turned out to be everything that mattered. Wexler had grown impatient. The telegrams to the territorial judge's office had reached him somehow, likely through Purnell, and he understood now that time wasn't on his side the way he'd assumed it would be. He meant to finish this before any circuit judge could ever set foot in the territory. One final push at the ranch and at the spring both, to burn out the evidence, scatter the witnesses, and make certain that whatever the judge eventually found, there would be nothing left standing to prove any of it. He'd set the night, 4 days out, and he meant to bring every man he had. If you've made it this far into Kaya and Ren's story, you already know it's the kind we don't get to tell often. Tap the join button beside the channel name to become a channel member. It helps keep more stories like this one coming, and it costs you almost nothing to give. Those 4 days changed something in all of them, quiet and unhurried the way real change generally is. Nothing like the sudden lightning strike kind that stories like to pretend it always was. Beshi rode north to carry word to his grandmother and to every family scattered along the old grazing route. Families who had spent years watching their neighbors vanish from the territory, one wagon at a time, and calling it bad luck because no one dared call it anything else. One by one, over those 4 days, they began arriving quietly at dusk, on foot and on horseback, men and women and children, who had every reason in the world to stay far away from a fight that wasn't officially theirs to have, and came anyway because Taji had died refusing to let it be taken from them without a fight, and because word had finally reached them that somebody else was willing to stand in that fight too. Ren watched them come into his yard, what was left of it, blackened where the barn had stood, rebuilt already in rough temporary form with borrowed lumber and willing hands, and felt something shift inside his own chest that he didn't have an easy name for. 8 years he had believed himself the loneliest man in the territory. It had never once occurred to him that loneliness could take two forms that had simply always been standing nearby, waiting, passed down the way a people passed down anything from one generation to the next, whether a person wanted the inheritance or not. In the evenings, once the work of preparing was done, rifles cleaned, positions walked and rewalked, water and shelter arranged for the families who would need it, Ren and Kaya found themselves sitting together at the edge of the firelight more often than either had planned to. She shared with him, slowly over those 4 nights, about her mother's weaving, about the songs her grandmother still sang at dawn, about a childhood spent following the spring water north and south, with the seasons the way her people always had. He opened up to her, finally, about Ellen, about the fever that took her in a single terrible week, about the years afterward spent making himself small enough that nothing could ever hurt that badly again, about how thoroughly that plan had failed the moment he saw a woman running across his land with nowhere left to run to. Neither of them named it. Neither of them needed to. It sat between them anyway, quiet and steady, the particular kind of understanding that grows between two people who have each survived a loss deep enough to reshape the whole rest of a life, and found against every reasonable expectation someone else standing in the wreckage who understood exactly what that cost. Word came from Beshy's grandmother on the 3rd night, carried by a rider who traveled 2 days without stopping to rest more than an hour at a time. Her account of the original agreement, spoken plain and recorded by a trusted hand, matched Taji's papers word for word, the spring, the grazing route, the binding accord signed years before any fence in the territory existed. It wasn't a courtroom, it wasn't a judge's gavel, but it was truth, set down and carried by people who had no reason left to lie. And it settled something in Kaya's face that Ren hadn't seen there since the night she first came stumbling out of the dark toward his empty raised hand. Wexler came on the 4th night exactly as Rourke had warned. He came with every rider he had, more than a dozen strong, moving at that same unhurried pace Ren had come to recognize and despise. Because men who rode slow toward a fight they expected to win never felt the need to hurry. What he did not expect, cresting the north ridge under a moon gone thin and silver, was to find the yard below him already full. Ren at the center with his rifle steady, Kaya beside him with the deed no longer hidden in a torn collar, but held plain in her hand for any man to see, Bechet and a dozen families spread in a careful line along the fence, and Rourke standing apart from the riders coming down off the ridge, having already made days before the choice the rest of them were only now arriving to make. Wexler reined in at the edge of the yard, and for the first time since Ren had known of him, something in that smooth, untroubled face flickered. "You've made a poor decision, Holloway, throwing in with people who have nothing. They have a signed agreement, a witness who watched it made, and about 30 of us standing here willing to say so in front of anyone who asks. That's not nothing. That's more than you've got." Wexler's eyes moved across the yard, counting, recalculating, the particular stillness of a man realizing the numbers he'd ridden in on no longer favored him the way he'd assumed they would. His gaze found Rourke standing apart from his own riders and held there a long, cold moment. "You're finished in this territory." Low, to him alone. I was finished the day I looked away from a man who once carried me 2 miles rather than let me die. Tonight I mean to stop being finished. It was Kaya who stepped forward then, into the space between the two lines. The deed held up where the moonlight caught the old ink plainly enough for every man present to see it. My brother died protecting this. Her voice carried clear and steady across the yard, no tremor left in it at all. Your men killed him for it in broad daylight, and you've spent 3 years taking land the same way. One family at a time, counting on nobody standing together long enough to stop you. We're standing together now. She let the silence hold a moment before continuing. You can ride away tonight and let the judge decide the rest in a courtroom where you might still find some way to twist it. Or you can try to finish what your men started at the spring, in front of every person standing here to witness it, and see how that story travels through this territory by morning. For a long moment, nothing moved. Ren watched Wexler's face and saw the calculation running behind it. Watched him weigh a dozen armed men against 30 witnesses who would carry this night into every town and homestead for 100 miles. Watched him understand, finally, that the quiet, unhurried advantage he'd always ridden on had run out the moment people stopped scattering and started standing their ground together. One of Wexler's hired men shifted uneasily in his saddle. Another wouldn't meet Kaya's eyes. Whatever loyalty money had bought in them, it hadn't bought enough to ride down 30 witnesses under a full moon with a signed deed held up plain for anyone to see. Wexler broke first, the way men like him always eventually did, once the numbers stopped working in their favor. He didn't apologize. Men like him never did. He simply turned his gelding, muttering something low and bitter to the riders still with him, and rode back north the way he'd come. This time without the unhurried ease of a man who believed the outcome already settled. Behind him, 2 of his hired men lingered a moment before following, and Ren understood, watching them go, that Wexler's grip on this territory had broken tonight in a way no single ride away could undo. The days that followed moved slower than the night itself had, the way justice in the territory generally did, whether a person had earned patience or not. The circuit judge arrived 9 days later, having received Ren's telegram and separately a second one Purnell hadn't managed to intercept. Sent quietly through a rider Rourke trusted more than he trusted the town sheriff. The judge heard the deed, the grandmother's recorded testimony, and a dozen accounts from families who had watched their neighbors vanish for 3 years and finally had someone willing to say so under oath. Wexler's claim to the spring and the grazing route was struck down within the week. The original agreement upheld exactly as it had been written, and Purnell, once it became plain how deep his arrangement with Wexler had run, found himself removed from his office by the same territorial authority he'd spent years quietly serving in secret. Wexler kept his ranch, diminished, watched closely now by eyes that hadn't been watching before. He never rode near the spring again. Rourke stayed on through the rest of that season and the ones after, working Ren's land as though the debt he'd once owed could somehow still be paid off, one honest day of labor at a time. He never explained much about the years he'd ridden for Wexler, and nobody pressed him to. Some things Ren had come to understand belonged to the man who carried them and not to anyone listening. The barn was rebuilt before winter, bigger than the one that burned, raised with the help of hands that had once stood along Ren's fence line as strangers and stood there still, now as something closer to family. The spring ran clear through that whole dry season, and the next, the old grazing route walked openly again for the first time in 3 years. Families moving north and south with the turn of the weather exactly as they always had, exactly as the old agreement, honored at last, promised they were owed. Ren and Kaya were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the edge of the very spring that had cost them both so much, with Beshi standing beside them and Kaya's grandmother, having finally made the long journey south herself, seated where she could see every part of it. It was not a large wedding. It did not need to be. There was a man who had spent 8 years believing smallness was the only safety worth having, and a woman who had run farther and lost more than either of them would ever fully put into words. And between the two of them now, morning after ordinary morning, something neither had expected to find again. A man, a woman, and a stretch of land finally meaning something. They built their life there slowly, the way anything worth keeping gets built, fence by fence, season by season, one hard-won ordinary day layered over the next. Some evenings, watching the sun go down gold over the ridge where 5 riders had once waited to take everything from her, Kaya would find Ren's hand without either of them remarking on it, and they'd sit together at the edge of the water that had cost them both so dearly and given them, in the end, so much more than either had thought a person was still allowed to hope for. The spring kept running, the way it always had, the way it always would now, quiet and constant under a wide Arizona sky, carrying forward everything that had almost been lost, and everything against every hard year behind them that had finally, at last, been saved.